Up till now, we've been talking about the individual components of supply and demand. Now we're going to start putting the two pieces of the market together and look at the concept of equilibrium. This material relies on readings from chapter 2 and 3 in the textbook. Now, before we start talking about supply and demand and equilibrium, we need to think about what we mean by a market. And so I've got this definition of a market that I'd like to talk to you about for a minute. In particular, economists and agricultural economists have thought about a market as some sphere or space where the forces of supply and demand are at work, where price is determined or modified, and the ownership of some quantity of a good or a service is transferred, and certain physical and institutional arrangements may be in place. There are some things that are important here. A market is, as the first line says, a sphere or a space. We typically think of a market as some sort of geographic space, but we've also started to see markets moving beyond a geographic space and include things like virtual markets such as eBay. Another point that's important here is that we've got both consumers and producers at work in that sphere or space. We've got demand and supply. And their interactions between those consumers and those producers is what determines the price. Now, what's also important here is that in the exchange of one good for some dollar amount, we're actually transferring the ownership of the good or the service from the person who's producing it, that is the firm, to the person who's going to consume it, that's the consumer. And there's certain institutional arrangements that might be in place. So these are really the laws and the rules and the regulations that govern what goes on in a marketplace. Now, what we want to do is join together those different forces of supply and demand. And it's important to recognize that really what we're talking about is that there's different groups of institutions that have evolved or is designed to facilitate the transfer of rights and titles and ownership in goods and services or property. So it's those institutions that underlie all the functions of the markets that we see, and getting those institutions right is very important. In particular, those institutions can be shaped by individuals. Economists talk about such institutions as regulations that govern what is allowed and not allowed with respect to food production as being humanly devised constraints that reflect the structure of political, economic, and social interactions between individuals. So the institutions we're going to sort of take for granted here, but lying underneath the surface is a whole range of different regulations, laws, and legislation that either prescribe what should be done or should not be done in particular circumstances. Now, as way of introduction, we're going to talk about market equilibrium with what's called perfect competition. I've made reference to this at various points in the course before, and if you've taken a course in economics previous to this, I'm sure that you've heard about perfect competition. There are certain assumptions that have to hold in order for perfect competition to be true. And we're going to talk about these assumptions, all of which can be relaxed. Some of these assumptions we will relax in the rest of the course. Others are too complicated and too advanced for us to relax in a first-year course. The first condition is that we have homogeneous products. And really what we're talking about is that the product that's being sold is very standardized so that the product sold by one firm is a perfect substitute for the product of another business. That's important because what it means is that buyers can shop around from one firm to another firm to try to find the same standardized product but at the lowest price possible. We also assume freedom of entry and exit. In particular, we assume that there's no restrictions such as licenses, review boards, quotas, patents, or other barriers to entry such as high capital requirements or brand loyalties. The same conditions must also hold for resources leaving the sector. So there's no restriction to leaving a sector such as having an unreasonable exit cost associated with it. Now, we can relax the freedom of entry and exit assumption. In fact, when we talk about supply management in the poultry and the dairy industry, we will relax this assumption to illustrate what can happen when it's not true. We also assume that there are many buyers and sellers. This is important because what it means is that no individual buyer or seller can influence the market in any significant way. And really what we mean here is that every buyer and seller is a price taker. What that means is no matter how much you buy or how much you sell, you can't influence the price in the market. We're also assuming perfect information. And what this means is that the people in the market who are either buying or are selling are aware of all the alternatives, particularly the prices, and also the quantities, qualities, and sources of supply. Now, this may seem a bit of an absurd assumption, but it makes transparent the different factors that we want to talk about in the course. We can relax this. In fact, economists have spent a great deal of time trying to relax this assumption, but it's a very complicated assumption to relax, and it makes it difficult to actually illustrate the notion of equilibrium when we're dealing with the supply and demand diagram. When all four of these conditions hold, a market is said to be perfectly competitive. And in that perfectly competitive market, a firm is a price taker. Now, what's important here is that they accept the price of the product that they're selling, or they're also accepting the price that it pays for an input as given. So you can be a price taker when you're both buying and when you're selling. And when you're taking the price as a buyer, it could be for a final good or service, or it could be for an input into your production process. Now, key to all of what we're talking about here is the concept of a market equilibrium. And this is what happens when supply and demand curves interact to determine the price and quantity of goods that are going to be bought and sold in the market. The same thing could hold for services. Equilibrium in a market for services happens when supply and demand interact to determine the price and the quantity of those services that are both bought and sold. Now here we've got some terms that I want to define. The first is market equilibrium. And really what we're talking about here is that all buyers and sellers are able to buy and sell as much as they want. That is to say, the market clears. All the supply that's put forward on the market is bought, and all the demand that's on the marketplace is satisfied by supply. We also have what's called an equilibrium price. This is the price at which consumers can buy as much as they want and sellers can sell as much as they want. In fact, what this really reflects is the fact that there's an interaction between supply and demand such that the price won't necessarily move from that equilibrium price. Economists often say that this is the price the market will bear to reflect the fact that no matter what an individual does, that's the price that that's going to prevail in the marketplace. An equilibrium quantity is the quantity that's bought and sold at the equilibrium price. And again, I want to emphasize this equilibrium quantity is such that the market clears. The quantity that's supplied on the market equals the quantity that is demanded on the market. Now, we're going to put supply and demand together, but before we do that, I want to quickly revisit the demand curve and the supply curve. These are fundamentally important tools that are used by economists when we're talking about how a market works, and I want to make sure everyone understands what I'm talking about. So recall that quantity demanded is the amount of a good that consumers would buy at a given price, holding constant all the other factors that influence purchases. Right? So we're holding constant the price of substitutes, we're holding constant the price of complements, we're holding constant income, we're holding tastes and preferences constant, we're holding everything but the quantity and the price of that good constant. The demand curve shows the quantity demanded at each possible price, holding fixed those other factors of demand. And in fact, we can generalize this by talking about what is called a demand function. Now, in the examples that we're going to talk about in the next little while, I'm going to use an example of processed pork products that's drawn from a study that was done in my department a number of years ago. And in this study, the quantity of processed pork that's demanded is a function of the price of pork, price of beef, the price of chicken, and income, where Q in this demand function is the quantity, P with the subscript P is the price of pork, P with the subscript B is the price of beef, P with the subscript C is the price of chicken, and Y is consumers' income, and D is just the demand function. Now, in our particular example, we're going to assume a demand function that looks like this function that I'm circling with the mouse right now. And we're going to use some values for the price of beef, the price of chicken, and income that are going to be held fixed and constant to simplify this. In particular, we're going to substitute the price of beef, which is equal to $4, into the price of beef in the pork demand equation. We're going to substitute out for the price of chicken in that equation as well, and for income in that equation. And when I do that, what I end up with is a term that gets added to the intercept. So when I make those substitutions and I add the various components related to the price of beef, chicken, and income to the intercept, I end up with this demand equation at the bottom that shows the quantity of pork that's going to be demanded is equal to an intercept minus a slope times the price of pork. What's important is that this is a demand curve that isolates the relationship between quantity and price of pork, holding fixed all other factors of demand at the prices and at the level of income that's shown here in the bullet point above that last demand equation. I've plotted this demand curve for pork in figure 8.1 of the notes, and I'm going to plot it here as well.
So this is literally the demand curve for pork in Canada. Or I should say a demand curve for pork in Canada. There could be other versions of this that people might estimate that perhaps reflect different factors of demand. And again, I want to emphasize this demand relationship holds other things constant. Now, how is this useful? Well, it's useful in a number of ways. The most important way is to say, let's suppose that price was initially at $3.30. Well, if I substitute $3.30 into the equation for the price of pork at the top of the screen, I'd calculate how much demand there would be for processed pork in Canada at 220 million kilograms of pork per year. Now, if the price of pork rose from $3.30 to $4.30, what would happen is that there would be a change in quantity demanded, and we're going to move along that fixed demand curve. In particular, we would move up to this new point of demand where quantity demanded is equal to 200 million kilograms of pork per year. And I've calculated 200 million kilograms of pork per year by simply substituting the new price of $4.30 into the price of pork in this demand curve and recalculated the quantity that would be demanded. Let's also revisit the supply curve, because again, this is an important component in terms of the two different sets of actors in the marketplace. And recall that the quantity supplied is the amount of a good that firms want to sell at a given price, holding constant all other factors that influence firm supply decisions, such as their costs and government actions. The supply curve is the quantity supplied at each possible price, holding constant all of those factors. And we can think about this in a little more general way by writing out what's called a pork supply function. And so in this supply function, we've got quantity of pork that's going to be supplied in millions of kilograms per year. And that's going to depend on the price of processed pork in dollars per kilogram and the price of hogs. And so what this is saying is that how much you're going to produce for the marketplace is going to depend on the price you receive for that pork and also the price you have to pay for hogs that you're going to be processing. And S is the particular functional form that you're going to use for that supply function. The estimated supply function for pork from the study that we're using to illustrate equilibrium is shown as the first equation on the screen. And what it shows is that quantity of pork supplied is equal to a function of the price of pork and the price of hogs. But recall, we want to isolate the relationship between quantity supplied and price of pork. So to do that, we substitute in the price of hogs into that supply function. What that then does is give us a product term that's going to be 60 times $1.50, and we integrate that component into the intercept. So the new intercept would be 178 minus 60 times $1.50. When we do that, we get a new supply function, and that's shown on the bottom of the screen. And that's equal to 88 plus 40 times the price of pork. That supply curve is also illustrated in figure 8.2 of the notes and is drawn here. And again, I want to emphasize that this supply curve holds all other things held constant. Now, this gives us enough to actually start figuring out what the equilibrium price and quantity would be. And so what's important is to recognize that an equilibrium is a situation in which no one wants to change his or her behavior. Everyone wants to stay there. They're happy where they are. So in that case, what we have to think about is how do we define an equilibrium? In economics, we define an equilibrium in a marketplace as such as when a market will clear. For our particular circumstances, that happens when supply equals demand. Everything that's produced and put up for sale is bought and consumed. So again, we want to get at this notion of the market clearing. And when we get at that notion of the market clearing, what we're really looking for is the point where the quantity supplied is equal to the quantity demanded. We can think about that kind of abstractly by recognizing that that's going to happen where the supply curve and the demand curve intersect right here. And in fact, it's true that for this particular supply and demand curve, that the equilibrium happens at this point E. At that point, the equilibrium price is $3.30, and the equilibrium quantity is 220 million kilograms of pork per year. Now, I didn't pick those numbers out of thin air. What I actually did is I set the demand curve for pork equal to the supply curve for pork, and I calculated the equilibrium price. I then substituted that equilibrium price back into the demand equation, and that allowed me to calculate how much is going to be, what the equilibrium quantity is going to be. I can illustrate that using math on this slide. So remember that the demand curve is 286 minus 20 times the price of pork. The supply curve is 88 plus 40 times the price of pork. My equilibrium requires supply to equal demand, right? So I've set quantity demanded is equal to quantity supplied. And if I substitute the equations in for quantity demanded and quantity supplied respectively, I end up with this term. So the term on the left is simply the demand curve from above, and the term on the right of the equal sign is simply the supply curve from above. This gives me one equation with one unknown, and I can solve that using very simple algebra, and what I would find is that the equilibrium price is $3.30. Now, I could calculate the equilibrium quantity by either substituting that price back into the demand equation or back into the supply equation. It doesn't matter which. And the reason why it doesn't matter which is that this is the price at which quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. I didn't say it's a price, it's the price. So I could calculate the equilibrium quantity either from the demand curve or from the supply curve. Here on the slides and in the notes, I've calculated quantity demanded, used that price in the demand equation to calculate the equilibrium quantity as 220 million kilograms. So it's a very simple process as long as you recognize the equality of quantity demanded and quantity supplied in the context of equilibrium. Now, what's important to recognize is that we rarely observe a true equilibrium in a marketplace. In fact, what we typically see is movement towards an equilibrium. But what's important is that that movement towards a market equilibrium occurs without explicit coordination between consumers and firms. All these consumers and firms are doing is going to a market and buying and or selling. But they're relying on the price signals that they observe in the marketplace to guide how much to buy and how much to sell. If the price is such that the market doesn't clear, if firms have overproduced, it will adjust. If the price is such that firms have underproduced relative to what the level of demand is, the price would also adjust. Now, for most agricultural goods, this is certainly the case because we have millions of consumers and thousands of firms making buying and selling decisions independently. Trying to coordinate the actions between those consumers and those producers would be very difficult to do indeed. And because there's this coordination that happens between buyers and sellers implicitly through a market, we have to often think about this as the decisions being made by a buyer or a seller being guided by an invisible hand or unseen market forces. Some say that we have an invisible hand that directs people to coordinate their activities to achieve a market equilibrium. Now, that invisible hand is really about what the price signals tell people in terms of whether the price is too high or too low, and then they reply or respond accordingly. So what I'm getting at here is that if the price is not at the equilibrium level, the consumers and or the firms have an incentive to change their behavior in a way that will drive price to an equilibrium level, in fact, to the equilibrium level. So for instance, if price is lower than equilibrium price, consumers would want to buy more than suppliers want to sell, and the price will adjust to that. And so will the quantities that are both being supplied and demanded. Let's talk a little bit more about this using the supply and demand diagram from before. So I've got the supply curve and the demand curve, and I've shown the equilibrium price and quantity shaded in lighter gray. And what I want to get at is what happens if price is too low or too high relative to what the equilibrium price would be. If we had a case where the price is too low, let's say $2.65, firms would want to produce 194 million kilograms of pork, but consumers would want 233 kilograms of pork. That creates a condition known as excess demand. Demand exceeds supply, and we have excess demand of 39 million kilograms. When we have excess demand, that tends to push the price up from the one that you observe in the marketplace. So with the excess demand of 39 million kilograms, we have the price of $2.65, and that shortage, that excess demand, is then going to result in price rising from $2.65 back to the equilibrium price of $3.30. Now, let's suppose that price were higher. Let's suppose that it were $3.95. At a price of $3.95, consumers would want 207 million kilograms of pork per year, but producers are going to want to supply 240 million kilograms of pork per year. There's a surplus. Producers have produced too much pork. We also call that an excess supply. And in this particular case, we have an excess supply equal to 23 million kilograms of pork. When we have excess supply, not everything gets bought. And not everything gets bought, the price tends to fall. And what that does is it sends a signal to producers to produce less, and it also sends a signal to consumers to consume more. So rather than seeing a price of $3.95 prevail in the marketplace, when we have excess supply, we see the price fall and the quantities adjust to return us back to the equilibrium quantity. Now, we've just talked about what would happen if the price increased or decreased, and I didn't necessarily say why the price increased or decreased. The reality is that those types of price increases or decreases away from equilibrium happen because there's been some shock to some factor of demand that's held constant or a factor of supply that's held constant, and that shifts the supply or the demand curve. I want to spend a few minutes talking about how we shock the equilibrium, and then in class on Wednesday and Friday we'll go through a number of examples to help illustrate all of this. So the point that I want you to all remember is that that equilibrium changes only if there is a shock that occurs that shifts the demand curve or the supply curve. So for instance, let's suppose the price of beef increased by 60 cents. When that happens, consumers will start to substitute pork for beef. And the reason for that is that beef is now relatively more expensive. And what this does is it causes the demand curve for pork to shift out. There's an increase in demand. I know that because if I substitute the new price of beef into the original demand function and then recalculate what the new intercept is, I would end up being on a demand curve that shifted out. We can illustrate that using the original demand and supply diagram that we had before. I'm showing the initial equilibrium here as E1. With the increase in the price of beef, there's going to be an increase in demand. And let's just suppose that that increase in demand shifts the demand curve from D1 to D2. If the price remained at $3.30, firms would still want to supply 220 million kilograms of pork per year, but now consumers would demand 232 million kilograms of pork per year. We now have a case of excess demand. There's a shortage in the marketplace. Well, based on what we just talked about, we know that when there's a shortage in the marketplace, that the price of the product tends to go up. Consumers value that product because there is a shortage, and they tend to bid the price of the product up. So what we can do is illustrate that by showing a higher price of $3.30 in this, $3.50 in this case, and a new equilibrium quantity of 282 million kilograms of pork per year. And we're denoting that new equilibrium as E2. We can illustrate the same kind of effect if there were a shift in supply. So suppose that the price of beef returned to the value that it had initially, but now that the price of hog rises by 25 cents per kilogram. It's now more expensive to produce pork because the price of a major input, that is hogs, has increased. When this happens, what we would do is substitute the new price of hogs into the original supply curve, recalculate the intercept, and then we would plot the new supply curve on a diagram. And what we would see is that that higher price of the input results in a decrease in supply. The supply curve is shifted up. We can illustrate that here, again, showing the initial equilibrium that we had before, but now what we're going to do is recognize that the increase in the price of hogs shifts the supply curve up to S2. If price didn't adjust, consumers would still want 220 million kilograms of pork, but now producers would only want to produce 205 million kilograms of pork. Again, we have, in this case, a shortage. We've got a situation of excess demand. And what we would see is that the price would rise. In particular, it would rise to $3.55 in this example, and we would have an equilibrium quantity of 215 million kilograms of pork per year. Now, all of this is really useful because it gives us a framework by which we can understand what happens when there's shocks in supply and demand, and a way to try to anticipate the direction in which prices and quantities will adjust when different things might change in a marketplace. But what's important is to recognize when to use the supply and demand model. For 90% of the situations that you might encounter, a supply and demand model is probably the appropriate way to think about the world. But it's not necessarily what you'd want to use in all circumstances. The supply and demand theory of people's wants can help us understand and predict those real-world events in many markets, and it explains what will happen to market equilibrium if the underlying conditions change. But it's only applicable when you've got perfectly competitive markets. So that is cases where everyone's a price taker, firms sell identical products, there's full information, and importantly, the costs of trading are low. Now, the cost of trading being low is about what we call transactions costs. And these are the costs associated with searching out someone to buy or to sell with, someone that you want to exchange goods with in exchange for money. If transactions costs are very high, then you don't necessarily want to use the supply and demand model. There's other models that would be more appropriate to use. We'll stop here and we'll go through a bunch of examples on Wednesday and Friday in class to illustrate both the notion of equilibrium and how we can calculate an equilibrium, but also how we can go about shocking the equilibrium to try to understand how there can be some predictive value to this framework.